Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2017. Can I ask everyone to please switch off their electronic devices or switch them to silent mode so they don't affect our work this morning? Can I welcome to the committee James Kelly, MSP, who is substituting this morning for Monica Lennon. Item 1, our first item is to decide whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Do members agree? Agreed. Thank you. Item 2, we will now take oral evidence on the Auditor General for Scotland's report entitled I6, a Review. I welcome to the meeting Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland, Mark Roberts, Senior Manager, and Catherine Young, Audit Manager of Audit Scotland. Before I invite an opening statement from Caroline Gardner, I want to put today's evidence session into some context. At our last meeting, this committee took evidence from the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland on the SPA's 2015-2016 accounts. Challenges clearly remain in ensuring that the anticipated savings from police reform are actually generated. The report we are considering today looks at I6, the national IT system that was intended to replace a number of IT systems used by the police. The report states clearly that failure of the I6 programme means that some of the benefits of police reform that should have arisen from implementing it have been at best delayed. Given what we know about the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland's finances, this is very concerning indeed. Today we want to examine why this programme failed and whether this could have been avoided. The report does not cover IT developments in Police Scotland since the termination of the I6 contract, so we will focus on what lessons can be learned from this failure. I now invite an opening statement from the Auditor General.
Thank you, Convener. In June 2013, the newly established Scottish Police Authority signed a contract for £46.1 million with Accenture to deliver a national IT system for Police Scotland. This system was known as I6. It was intended to replace over 130 IT and paper-based systems inherited from Police Scotland's predecessor forces and to transform how Police Scotland records, manages and analyses information. I6 was planned to go live in September 2014, with full national rollout by August 2015. 3 years after signing the contract, in July 2016, the Scottish Police Authority and Accenture mutually agreed to terminate the contract for the I6 programme. The contract was signed by the Scottish Police Authority, but day-to-day management rested with Police Scotland. The I6 programme failed because of a disagreement about the scope of the programme, the interpretation of the contract, and the extent to which Police Scotland's requirements were met by Accenture's solution. This disagreement arose despite an 18-month procurement process, which we found did follow good practice and included intensive engagement with potential bidders. The disagreement surfaced almost immediately after the signing of the contract in June 2013 and permanently damaged trust, relationships and confidence between Police Scotland and Accenture. The signing of a contract variation agreement in April 2014 reset relationships and put the programme on a more positive footing, but this proved temporary. One of the factors that contributed to Accenture being awarded the contract was its past experience of delivering an IT system to the Guardia Civil in Spain. Initially, it was believed that the majority of the I6 system could be based on this system. As time went on, though, it became clear that a significant amount of the system would have to be built from scratch. The approach to software development used in the I6 programme meant that Police Scotland finally received the I6 system for full user testing in June 2015. At this point, Police Scotland identified fundamental problems with the system. In August 2015, Accenture indicated to the I6 Programme Board that its confidence of meeting the revised go-live date of December 2015 was at 91%. But following an analysis exercise, Accenture revised its estimated go-live date to April 2018. At this point, the Scottish Police Authority, Police Scotland and Accenture undertook an options appraisal exercise to agree the best way forward. Following this, the Scottish Police Authority and Accenture entered into negotiations and agreed to terminate the programme in July 2016. They agreed a settlement of £24.65 million. This figure included a refund of all of the money paid to Accenture, a total of £11.09 million, plus an additional payment of £13.56 million. As you said in your opening remarks, Convener, the failure of the I6 programme does mean that some of the benefits of police reform that should have come from it have been at best delayed, and there are also wider implications for the modernisation of the justice system. Our audit concentrated on the history of the I6 programme and the factors behind its failure. I have asked the auditors of the Scottish Police Authority to monitor ICT developments as part of the annual audit process, and this is particularly important given the emphasis placed on the use of technology in the recently published draft Policing 2026 strategy. I also put on record my intention to publish a report on the lessons to be learned from this and other ICT projects that I've reported on in May this year. Convener, alongside me are Mark Roberts and Catherine Young, who've worked on the project, and as always, we'll do our best to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to now open questioning from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, sadly we've become accustomed in the public sector to IT projects that don't deliver. Looking at this particular project, it would appear you say the process for procuring a supplier for the I6 system followed recommended good practice. And there seems to me that, oddly enough, Police Scotland don't seem to have done anything wrong here. They followed the recommended procedure, and at the end of the day, it didn't work. Is there a problem with the procedure that's being followed? Is the recommended good practice not up to snuff?
I will ask Mark to come in a moment. I think we would say that absolutely in this case, Police Scotland did follow good practice, and there were some real benefits from that, although the programme ultimately failed. The quality of the contract that they entered into did mean that in this case there was no direct loss to the public purse. Police Scotland were able to settle in Accenture in a way that recovered the payments they've made, plus a significant sum in compensation. So that reflects the benefit of a thorough procurement process, even though in this case, as I say, it didn't work through.
So the public purse is actually facing an opportunity loss rather than a financial loss.
The loss is absolutely the wider benefits that this system was intended to achieve, both in terms of savings to policing and operational benefits for police officers and police staff. We go on to say in the report there was no single reason for its failure, but it's certainly clear that the procurement approach that Police Scotland took in this case was not one of the reasons for failure.
Just looking at your report on page 6, paragraph 8, they've got here Deloitte as external experts on procurement and managing commercial contracts, Eversheds as legal advisors, and Exception UK as technical advisors. That must have cost quite a bit. Do we know how much these external consultants cost?
I don't have the figure here. Colleagues may do, or it may be something you want to pursue with the Scottish Police Authority. But you asked earlier about the good practice which is available, and that good practice does indicate that it's important for the client, in this case Police Scotland, to make sure it does have access to the professional skills that are needed. And in this case, legal skills, procurement skills and IT skills were the right one. The committee might recall that one of the problems with the NHS 24 system was that the contract itself didn't stand up to challenge when things went wrong. In this case, that didn't happen, and that's clearly a positive.
But even with all this external support, it still didn't work. Even following good practice, it didn't work.
It didn't work. We say in the report there was no single reason for that. I'll ask Mark to talk you through what we think the underlying factors were in this case.
I think, as the Auditor General said, there were strenuous efforts made to bring in external expertise and to learn lessons from past experience during the procurement stage, and there was a large amount of engagement with potential bidders. This process kind of really kicked off in 2011 with large-scale meetings with potential bidders, which they gradually focused down to the preferred bidder, and a really very, very intensive amount of discussion with potential bidders. I think there were 160 kind of dialogue workshops to discuss the technical requirements of the system. One of the other factors we draw out in the report is the approach to the development of the system, the waterfall approach, which, although widely used at that time, what we've heard is very clearly that type of approach to software development and system development would not be recommended these days. There'd be much more focus on an agile approach to development. So there was a methodological issue as well, which meant that it was quite hard for Police Scotland to see the scale of the challenges facing the programme until quite late in the overall timeline.
Still looking at the external support here. Paragraph 19 on page 10, we're talking about the Scottish Government's Gateway team, and they have their external reviews suggested that delivery confidence was either amber or green throughout the course of the programme, and the recommendations that they made were adopted by Police Scotland. So again, how could that be? Because clearly, even at a relatively early stage, there were indications of some problems, although assurance was given by Accenture that they were being managed. But here we are again, external party doing the necessary box-ticking exercise, and it still didn't work.
As you can imagine, that's an issue we looked at quite closely in this exercise, particularly given our experience of other large IT projects and the problems they've encountered. I think our conclusion in this case was that given Accenture was giving strongly positive assurances to the programme board about its ability to deliver I6 and the waterfall approach that Mark's just described, which means you can't test the system until the whole system is in place, it would have been difficult for the gateway reviews and the other reviews that were taking place to raise stronger concerns than they did. They did identify some areas for improvement which were acted on, again a positive by Police Scotland in this case, but it feels to us that the way the system was designed to be delivered and the assurances that were being given by Accenture made it difficult for the reviews to conclude differently from the assurances that they were able to give.
Are we saying here that no matter what we put in place, basically, if a company like Accenture effectively lies, that there's no protection against that at the end of the day?
I can't speculate about what underlay the assurances that Accenture was given to the programme board. I can tell you, and we say in the report, that the programme board challenged very strongly the assurances that it was getting from Accenture through the process. I think the things that would likely be different in future are the approach to developing the system. We've talked about the agile approach, which means you're testing as you go along, rather than a big wholesale development then being handed over for user testing at quite a late stage in the process. So that should enable problems to be identified and tackled earlier than was the case in this one. But clearly there is an issue with the internal resourcing and delivery capability of any large contractor, particularly in the case of IT systems, which tend to be quite a black box, even to people with expertise in technology under the waterfall design approach. Looking at how this worked in the round, is there any aspect where we can learn from, where we can try and protect ourselves for the future? Is there something we can do better to try and get an earlier warning that there's a problem? I'll ask Mark to come in a moment. I think the one thing I would flag is we say in the report that this was happening at a time of a great deal of political and professional scrutiny of the establishment of Police Scotland. A number of things going on around the establishment of the SPA and Police Scotland itself, and I've reported on some of the disagreements and tensions that were in there. A previous failed IT performance system, performance management system before the establishment of IT. And some high-profile challenges for policing around things like stop and search, armed officers and control centres. And I think all of that probably had the effect of increasing the focus of both the SPA and Police Scotland on ensuring that this system worked. And I think that may have introduced that sort of optimism bias that is often a factor of large projects like this. Mark, I think, can give you a bit more flavour of what they've seen from inside the audit work.
The programme board considered terminating the contract as early as October 2013, so that was 3 months after the contract initially they signed. So that was fairly rigorously considered. What happened was an agreement between Police Scotland and Accenture to continue with the process and to try and make it work. As the Auditor General said, there was a great deal of determination on both sides. They both wanted to try and deliver the system, and that resulted in the signing of a contract variation agreement in early 2014. So within the first year of the programme, I think there was willingness to consider that option of terminating, but again, the ultimate decision was we want to carry on doing this. We're going to try and make this work. As with any major program of work like this, there are likely to be difficulties and challenges, and I think they thought that they could overcome those. But some of the early problems and the impact that those had had on relationships were things which flowed throughout the course of the whole program.
Okay, Liam.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd actually like to follow on from Colin Beattie's questions and just keep looking at the start of the process. So the report's fairly clear that Police Scotland appear to have followed recommended good practice. If we accept that Accenture will not have gone into this contract to fail, they will have gone in good faith. I am interested in the role of the external experts who were advising, because within weeks things start to go wrong. First of all, doesn't that suggest that the advisors bear some culpability on this? Deloitte's, Eversheds and Exception UK.
Again, I think I'd go back to my response to Mr. Beattie's question, which is that in the at the end of this process, the contract was robust enough to enable Police Scotland to recover not only the payments they've made, but a significant sum in compensation as well. And in my experience, that is exceptional in cases of this nature. Something clearly went badly wrong. We've identified a number of things which we think contributed towards it, but Police Scotland's contract was as strong as it could have been, I think, in protecting them from the direct consequences of that. There clearly is an opportunity cost in terms of the savings and the operational improvements that were intended to come from it, but the contract itself looked robust.
I accept that it was robust in the sense of recouping in indemnities if something went wrong, but in terms of its scope and all parties' understanding of what they were signing up to, it appears to have been significantly deficient. Isn't that right?
It's certainly true that there was a significant disagreement between the two parties about what the contract was intended to deliver. And we think one of the factors that underlies that is Accenture's experience of delivering the system for the Guardia Civil in Spain, which they thought would provide a very strong basis for development for what I6 needed, and which was a significant part of the decision to award them the contract. In practice, some of the things which actually were set out in the contract, and again, which contributed towards this ability to recoup the payments that have been made, actually differed significantly from what was in the Spanish experience. Mark, do you want to add to that?
I think the crux of the disagreement actually focused on very, very small part of the contract as a whole. The contract contained reference to the user requirements, which were kind of what Police Scotland wanted the system to deliver. And from Accenture's point of view, they'd presented a solution that they thought was going to meet those user requirements. And what emerged very, very quickly was, despite, as the Auditor General said, an 18-month competitive dialogue process, there was a gap between those two things. But there was another clause in the contract which said the user requirements took precedence over the contractor's solution. So Police Scotland reverted to that precedence clause to say, well, what we say in terms of our user requirements must take precedence, and we want you to deliver that. Accenture's position was very much that you've agreed what our proposed solution is going to be, and that's what we'll deliver.
But does that not suggest that there was a significant degree of ambiguity in the contracts that were signed by the parties?
I think that's certainly what you could interpret it very much that way.
And when I was in professional practice, I was paid to make sure there was no ambiguity in my client's contracts. So does that not suggest that the failing here, or a failing, is with the professional advisors that have been engaged?
I think that would be something that we've not looked into that in detail. I think that would be something you'd perhaps have to discuss with the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland. Right.
Because just staying with that, I just wonder, Colin Beattie quite rightly asked the question, how much was paid? And I accept your answer earlier on, Mark Roberts. But how much was paid to them, and was that recouped as part of the penalty from Accenture? Because I suspect not.
We don't have a detailed breakdown of the costs that were paid to those external consultants by Police Scotland as part of their client team. As the Auditor General said, that the settlement agreement contained an additional payment over and above the monies that have been paid direct to Accenture, and that reflected some of the additional costs that have been incurred by Police Scotland. So that includes Police Scotland's staff costs at an estimated level, hardware costs, software licenses. I don't know whether any of that was any estimated costs of those third-party advisors.
I wonder if that's something that should be investigated.
I think that's something that you could consider with the Scottish Police Authority.
Thank you. Just moving on in time on this process, there was a contract variation. So at the start, we can see that apparently there was an 18-month window where Police Scotland were getting a great deal of advice, potentially very expensive advice, and all parties I suspect tried to put in place something that worked. There is then a contract variation. That does not seem to have gone through the same rigour. Would that be fair to say?
It certainly wasn't as in-depth process, but it was a variation of the existing contract. So that would seem to be reasonable. It was focusing, once they knew more about where the issues were, I think they were concentrating on where the attention needed to be paid. So it wasn't like restarting the whole contract discussions and establishment from scratch again. It was adjusting the existing contract. So certain things happened. For example, Police Scotland took on responsibility for data migration, which had previously been something that Accenture had been going to deliver. So they were adjusting the existing contract at a relatively small level in trying to try and pick up some of the problems that existed.
But who was doing that, Mark?
That was being done between the Police Scotland, advised by their external advisors, and in discussion with Accenture.
And do you know who those external advisors were?
They were the same ones who were involved from the start, as listed in paragraph, I think it was paragraph 12. Sorry, paragraph 8
on page 6. Because again, the contract variation doesn't work. And that would tend to suggest that somebody has been poorly advised. Doesn't it?
I'm not sure I would follow that interpretation. Mark will want to come in again in a moment. I think the fact that the contract variation could be agreed, again, is an indication of the strength of the contract that Police Scotland had entered into. What it did was to embed in the revised contract the user requirements that Mark's described to you, filling the gaps between what Police Scotland interpreted as being the user requirements in the contract and what Accenture thought their solution would deliver. So the gaps were filled, not changing the cost, but changing the delivery milestones and the delivery date. So it clarified that Police Scotland's user requirements were what was required from the contract at no additional cost. Now, you're right, it didn't work, but I think it was a best endeavours attempt to enforce Police Scotland's user requirements on the contract at that point. And again, the issue is the confidence and capability of Accenture to deliver that within the cost and the broad timescales that were agreed. Mark, is that a fair comment?
I think that's a fair reflection of the situation.
Final question then. Are you able to tell us, has any person, has any group really been held to account for these failures? I accept that you say there are a number of moving parts and a number of points the ball seems to have been dropped. But who has dropped the ball and what has happened to them?
The formal solution was that the parties agreed to terminate the contract, and Accenture made a significant payment which refunded £11 million that they'd received as milestone payments, together with £13.5 million of compensation for staff time and other costs that had been incurred. So in that very direct sense, the penalty fell with Accenture. There have been, as the committee knows, a number of changes of personnel within both Police Scotland and the SPA since it was established in 2013. And I think the broader questions might be better addressed to the SPA and Police Scotland by the committee.
Thank you.
James Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I want to touch on some of the project management issues. You've said in some of the previous answers that the approach used was a waterfall approach, which basically involved going through all the phases of the system build and then handing over to Police Scotland to do the user testing. How many phases did that involve, and what was the kind of time scale between that starting and then it being handed to Police Scotland in June 2015?
So the phases that it went through kicked off very, very soon after the contract was signed with a high-level design phase. And then in broad terms, there are 4 further stages of detailed design, functional design, product testing, and which was done by Accenture and would be done by any contractor in such a program management setup. And then it was only the final stage of user acceptance testing when it was handed over to Police Scotland for testing, so they could actually see what the system was doing. Now that actually happened in the summer of 2015, and you'll recall from the Auditor General's previous answers that a go live for the system as a whole was initially expected to be September 2014. So Police Scotland didn't see the system until some 9 months after the original go live date for the system as a whole. So what had happened during the course of the programme was that dates had slipped. Some of these phases, which originally had been envisaged to be sequential, so the waterfall methodology has one stage after another, had begun to being overlapped. And that was an area of significant challenge by the I6 programme board to Accenture and saying, why are these stages having to be overlapped? This is generating additional risk and so forth. But that was an attempt to try and keep the programme moving and keep it on track.
I can't, it's been a long time since I've worked in software development, but I can't for the life of me understand why someone would sign up to an approach that involves the developer going through all the design stages, the build stages, which I assume involved their internal testing, and then only once that had all been completed, handed it over. Has there been any questioning of Police Scotland or their external advisors as to why they accepted the waterfall approach?
I mean, we certainly sort of spoke to programme managers who were around at the time to say sort of why was that approach adopted, and it was very much sort of seen that was sort of an approach which was used at that time and was accepted. Accenture did provide demonstrations during the course of the programme to Police Scotland, but there was no full handover of the code so that Police Scotland could really get into the nitty-gritty of it. I think it's very clear, and indeed the chair of the Scottish Police Authority has said publicly they wouldn't do it in this sort of way again, and it would always be a much more modular, more agile approach to development that would be adopted now. But I think at the time it was very clear that they were quite determined to use that waterfall approach.
But did anybody query the use of that waterfall approach?
I don't think we're aware of anything in terms of challenge that we've seen in terms of people saying, is there an alternative development methodology? Not that we've seen in terms of board papers. Catherine will know more detail.
There was some discussion at the latter part of the programme around some of the modules perhaps being done in an agile fashion. But again, as Mark said, there was no evidence that it was fully considered, as they'd already agreed, and both parties had agreed to the waterfall approach. I think around that era it was gaining popularity, but at the outset waterfall was used at the time.
So there was basically an acceptance that Accenture would outline this is the approach we're going to adopt, and Police Scotland signed on to that.
I think it was an agreement between the two, that the Police Scotland were also, or the organisations that preceded Police Scotland, because all of this was going on prior to the establishment of Police Scotland. The original business case was agreed by the then Association of Chief Police Officers of Scotland. It only actually all the procurement phase predated the SPA and Police Scotland.
And what about the testing that Accenture were doing internally before handing over to Police Scotland? Was there any visibility or transparency around that?
As I said, there were demonstrations given of what the system was doing, and certainly Police Scotland's programme management team visited the Accenture's development centres both in Newcastle and Mumbai, but there wasn't any kind of detailed handover of the code, as I've said.
Did they know if Accenture was doing any proper testing?
They did know that Accenture was doing testing, and one of the things that came out from the programme board was quite a lot of challenge about Accenture's methodology for testing, which the programme board felt was not reflecting industry standards. What Accenture was saying is this is our testing methodology we have used elsewhere in many cases, and that's what we're going to use. But there was tension around how that approach was being done.
But with the exception of the system demonstrations, which basically involve getting people in a room like this and firing the stuff up on a screen, there wasn't any kind of visibility of the actual results of the testing?
Not as far as we're aware.
Yeah.
Around the product test stage, there was a number of flaws identified, and there was a lot of disagreement between Accenture and Police Scotland around the level of how critical these errors were. A lot of challenge again from board members about these errors, and when they moved into user acceptance stage, some of the errors that had been found at product test stage were unresolved. The methodology, again, a lot of challenge around it not being standard industry practice. There was a new programme manager on Police Scotland's side that came on who'd had quite a significant IT background and who himself was able to get in and look at the coding around it. So I think again from board minutes there was a lot of discussion around the actual detail coding on it didn't meet industry standard practice.
Right, okay, right. It doesn't sound all that satisfactory. In terms then, just final question, Convener, just in terms of moving forward then, it's clear to me that this waterfall methodology has got serious flaws with it. And in terms of other IT projects in the public sector, what confidence do we have that that approach is not being used and a more robust approach has been used, which involves the product's been handed over in phases to allow the users to test it more robustly as each phase is completed and to give more overall confidence to the users?
As I said in my opening remarks, I'm planning to publish in May a report which looks across the range of IT projects that I've reported on over the last few years. It's certainly true that an approach like the waterfall method that was widely used 5-7 years ago is now much less commonly used. We're seeing much more use of Agile. In some of the reports I've produced, we've had a concern that Agile was being used by people who didn't fully understand it or weren't properly trained in it. But what I want to do in my May report is to pull all of that together and give some assurance to the committee about the current position.
Okay, thank you.
Ross Thompson.
Thank you, Convener. Following on from some of the same sort of line of question that we've had, in your report, you talk about a year and a half worth of dialogue. We're still at the very end of the day. The functionality of Accenture's programme would never meet the requirements of what Police Scotland were looking for, which is fairly fundamental. So, in my head, I'm trying to understand exactly how that came about. So, were Police Scotland ever clear from the outset in terms of what technical requirements they needed from the system at such an early stage?
Yes, again, I'll ask Mark to come in, but I think the user requirements that were specified in the contract were the basis of them being able to achieve the settlement they did when the plug was pulled. Okay. Mark.
So, yeah, Police Scotland were, and I think probably are, still confident that their user requirements set out exactly what they wanted it to do. Mm-hmm. Accenture responded with a solution which they felt met those requirements with some qualifications and believed that Police Scotland had agreed to that. What Accenture felt was that going beyond their solution, there'd been what they described as a continual elaboration of requirements. So what they're saying, the scope was getting bigger and bigger is what they felt was going on. At the same time, Police Scotland were maintaining absolutely that we have not changed our user requirements. And as I said in answer to Mr. Kerr, there was this precedence clause within the contract which says the user requirements are paramount, and that's what they continually referred back to. So that was what we feel is at the heart of the difference in terms of Police Scotland feeling that sort of they'd been clear about what they'd been requiring, Accenture feeling like there was continual expansion of the scope of the programme.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. So Police Scotland have been clear from the outset what their technical requirements were, what their expectations were. On page 8 of the report, you talk through the procurement process and the early design stage. And I think it was in November 2012, where it's paragraph 14. As part of that long process, we know procurement can take time, Accenture scored the highest against the technical and implementation criteria, not on cost, but on that point. So has there been a failure in due diligence on the procurement side?
What was made very clear to us when we were speaking to people was that the experience that Accenture had in, as the Auditor General describes, delivering a system to the Spanish police force, albeit a more simple system, was a very important criteria, and that is reflected in the weighting that was assigned within that procurement scoring exercise. At the same time, it was made very, very clear that while cost was obviously an important factor, the quality of the system that they got was what Police Scotland were really wanting to get to. And that's why the technical and implementation criteria were sort of very, very important in Accenture securing the bid. In terms of whether or not there's been a failure of due diligence, as we say in the report, and as the Auditor General said, in terms of following best practice, we do think that the police did that. And obviously, as we've already discussed, that didn't actually manifest itself in a successful outcome. The procurement process, though, was, we think, robust.
Okay. Again, going back to the point that, again, Police Scotland had been clear, following on just from your answer there, and following on actually from the points that Colin Beattie made earlier on, would it be fair to suggest that Accenture had been in any way misleading during that process in terms of their offer and in terms of what they were advising they could produce for Police Scotland, given at the end of the day that the user requirements and what Police Scotland wanted were significantly different to what they got? Would it be fair to suggest that Accenture maybe had misled them?
I think a fair reflection might be that they had underestimated the complexity of the system. There was a repeated theme throughout the challenge presented by the programme board in terms of the extent to which, in terms of the actual people getting involved from the Accenture side, the extent of knowledge of policing and the specific requirements of the Scottish policing environment. And so that, I think, was an issue which was raised repeatedly by the programme board.
Okay. The Auditor General, in response to Colin Beattie, when he was again questioning around this particular subject, said that the SP board did provide challenge. So my question is what kind of challenge did they present at the time, and how robust was that challenge to Accenture?
It was the programme board, the I6 programme board, that was providing the challenge, and I'll ask Catherine to talk you through it. She's the person who spent an awful lot of time reading the board minutes and talking to people about what happened at them.
I think around the initial stage where a gap was identified between the requirements and the contractor solution, there was a lot of discussion around how, well, neither party had picked that up in the 160 dialogue sessions. So it all came back to interpretation of requirements. And the search function was quite a significant issue at that stage. Accenture Solution said it would do one thing, and the requirement was different. And it was only at the very early design stages that was picked up. And again, coming back to the contract, obviously because the requirements take precedence, that was Police Scotland's standpoint was it must fulfil the requirements of the contract. Throughout the other stages of the programme, the challenge was around the quality of information it was receiving from Accenture, questions again around the test strategy and the methodology being applied. There was also another layer of governance in terms of the day-to-day contract management. I believe at that point, again, there was more discussions around the detail of the issues there.
I think there was also a lot of concern expressed about the timeliness of the documentation. There was a lot of material being provided to the programme board very last minute. And as Catherine said, some sort of the quality of the documentation was another focus for challenge as well.
I think there was one final point for completeness to mention. After relationships had deteriorated quite early on, the programme board asked Accenture to express their confidence of delivery as a percentage rather than simply the red, amber, green flags. And I think the percentage ratings that were being expressed by Accenture were being challenged quite strongly by the programme board.
Actually, on that point, that was another question. Very early on, as is highlighted in the report, there was that breakdown in trust from a very early stage, and also I think it says confidence as well in the report. If there was no trust and no confidence in the ability of Accenture to deliver at such an early stage, why did we keep continuing? Why wasn't something done earlier? Why did we, because that's not a workable relationship. How could that ever have been productive?
I think it's a very good question, and it's one we touched on earlier in our answers. There was a great deal riding on this system, this programme, for both the police in Scotland and for Accenture. You're right, problems emerged very soon after the contract had been signed. But I think for Accenture, they were very concerned to deliver this system. It was seen as being important globally for them. For the police, there was a real concern to demonstrate that they could deliver an IT system that fulfilled its requirements, both as part of boosting confidence in the new policing arrangements in Scotland and because of its importance in achieving the financial savings and the operational benefits that were foreseen in the business case. Now, I think that's probably one of the areas where we think there may be lessons to be learned about not allowing that pressure, that optimism to colour decision-making that's being taken when problems start to arise. That doesn't mean that we think the actions that Police Scotland took to try and bring the contract back on track weren't appropriate, but there is a question, I think, about whether the plug could have been pulled sooner.
Because that very neatly takes me on to my last question, Convener, which is on page 11 of the report. It actually talks about, on paragraph 26, the failure of a previous ICT project in 2012, where you would have thought that lessons would have been learned, and it finishes that paragraph by saying that there may have been misplaced optimism about the prospects of success. For me, it sounds like throughout this process, there's been this misplaced optimism. Would you say it's fair to suggest that really a lot of it's been done on a wing and a prayer, with your eyes closed, hoping it's going to get better, and it never did?
I don't think that is fair. I think there is an element of optimism, and you're right to point to exactly that paragraph and that sentence in the report. I think, though, that this was not naive optimism. Police Scotland and the programme board, the programme team, did what was required of them, and did it thoroughly, against a backdrop of, as Marcus said, a complex but real disagreement between them and their contractor about what this system was going to deliver. I do think it's unusual in the public sector for the client to not only recover what they've paid, but also a sum in compensation, and I think that reflects the fact that they followed good practice in procurement, and the project was undermined by that difference of view about what the system should deliver.
Thank you. Thank you,
Alex Neil.
Can I go back to your estimate? I mean, this has been going on for 4 years, and the original plan was, I think, that by now this would have saved about £200 million or thereabouts, or over a period of time, £200 million. Does the compensation element include compensation for not realising all of, well, obviously not all, but part of the £200 million of savings, which would have been realised had this been handled properly and competently?
First of all, it's good to see you back, Mr. Neil.
Thank you very much.
Secondly, it was £200 million of financial savings plus other operational benefits across a 10-year period, I think, and the Appendix 1 sets out the phasing of that. The information that we've been able to obtain from the SPA is that the compensation payment was not for the benefits foregone, but instead for staff time and for other direct costs such as software licenses and hardware maintenance that had been incurred. It was the result of a negotiation between the SPA and Accenture rather than a precise figure, but the information we have is that it covers those direct costs rather than benefits foregone.
Should it have included benefits foregone?
I think that's a question you'll have to ask the SPA.
But as the Auditor General, do you think, in terms of the protection of public money, should it have included that element?
That's clearly my main concern about this programme, as I've said in the report and in my opening remarks this morning. This was a central part of police reform in terms of both the savings that were intended to be achieved, but also, and much more significantly, I think, over time, improvements in the way that police officers and police staff carry out their work and the way in which the whole criminal justice system can operate. Now, those benefits have been at best delayed, and there isn't currently a plan for when and how they'll be achieved. Now, whether it was ever feasible for SPA to negotiate compensation for that opportunity cost from Accenture, I'm not in a position to say. But I think that is the question about how we now go about achieving those benefits in future.
Did the contract provide, or were there any restrictions in the contract that would have prevented, when it broke down, claiming compensation for savings foregone?
I would be surprised if there were restrictions of that sort in there. I think the contract was about what will be delivered at what price, rather than the compensation arrangements that would be in place if that wasn't delivered.
And do we know if the SPA actually asked for any element of the compensation to cover the savings foregone, or did they just forget about it, or ignore it, or not raise it, or did Accenture say no way?
It was a commercial negotiation, and I think you would need to ask the SPA about the content of it.
Okay. And when do you think Police Scotland is going to be in a position to put a plan in place to recover the situation and get into a position where they can get a computer system that does realise these savings?
I've said in my report and on the record that it's urgent they now do so. They have foregone having those benefits in place now as we speak, based on the original delivery dates. The Policing 2026 strategy that was published just a couple of weeks ago is absolutely centred on much better, much more flexible use of IT to help police officers be out and about doing their work on behalf of all of us across Scotland. And there currently isn't a plan for how those benefits will be achieved. There isn't a date for that, and it's something the committee may want to explore with the SPA and Police Scotland.
Definitely, that's something we want to follow. And can I just finally ask you, Auditor General, you said that you're going to be publishing what you think are the lessons to be learned from this episode. Can I ask you, A, when you're going to publish that, and B, can you give us any indication this morning of what the 3 or 4 main lessons are likely to be?
The planned publication date at the moment is in May of this year. And we're working towards that at the moment. As I said in response to an earlier question, I think from Mr. Beattie, it's intended to pull together lessons learned from all of the IT projects I've reported on during my time in this role. And I would prefer to hold off until the report itself is published, but I think many of them will be familiar to you as members of this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Auditor General, what was the Scottish Government's role in all of this?
Mark, do you want to pick that up?
As we previously discussed, the Scottish Government provided us at various points pre-award contract and in the early stages of the post-contract timeline, gateway reviews looking at certain aspects of the programme, for example, kind of governance arrangements, and they made recommendations about governance. After, within the first year of the programme, after award, the then Deputy Chief Information Officer from the Scottish Government joined the programme board to provide additional support. That individual comes from a commercial and software development background, and he kind of supplemented the existing kind of programme board to provide external challenge and also external expertise.
Mm-hmm. We've seen this in NHS as well, the Scottish Government sending in troubleshooters after problems arise, which is clearly the right thing to do. But can you tell me, did the Scottish Government have any formal responsibilities in this, and were they understood by both parties, both police and Accenture?
The contract was signed between the Scottish Police Authority and Accenture, and while I'm sure that the government were aware of what was going on, and no, I don't think over and above that membership of the programme board, they had any direct involvement in the day-to-day management or the scrutiny of what was happening.
I mean, clearly, you also outline the political context for this, and you're saying there's no day-to-day role in the scrutiny of what was happening, but there was a lot of pressure on government at that point to make a success of this. The legislation had not long passed through this Parliament. Is there any indication from the research that you have done from your audit that the Scottish Government could have taken a more proactive role in trying to facilitate a better relationship or a more profitable contract?
I don't think we've seen any evidence to say that was explored in any great detail. I think it was very much that this was going to be maintained, that on a day-to-day basis, programme management was handled within Police Scotland with ultimate oversight through the Scottish Police Authority, and then from then, even more indirectly, on to ministers.
Okay. Do you know how often reports went to ministers?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Okay. I mean, your report says at paragraph 20 that the I6 programme had difficulties almost immediately. I think we've all been in the situation where you look back on a project's success and think, actually, there were teething troubles with this right at the start. Maybe we should have called a halt to it or looked for an alternative at that point. Was there any indication in your audit that that had been considered?
As I said in response to an earlier question, as early as October 2013, so within 3 months of awarding the contract, there was consideration about whether to terminate the contract at that point. Again, as we say in the report, and we've said earlier, there was genuine determination, I think, on both sides to try and make this work, and they recognised, as you described, teething problems were perhaps inevitable, and they were going to try and resolve that. Ultimately, and looking at it with hindsight, that didn't happen. Whether they could have pulled the plug earlier than they ultimately did, I think is a moot point. But that's within the context of this was a very, very important element of police reform, and was going to significantly improve information management and analysis and information sharing across the national force.
Okay. And that consideration of termination, was there any ministerial involvement in that?
Not as far as I'm aware. I think that was done at an SPA, Police Scotland level. Okay.
I mean, obviously, you've said already in your evidence this morning, the report makes clear that this project for Accenture was of global significance, big company and a huge contract. So having looked to other countries, do other countries have perhaps a public sector body that can guarantee good practice in terms of IT that we're perhaps lacking here in Scotland?
I'll kick off and Mark may want to come in. One of the things we've said in evidence to the committee before is that the UK government digital service is doing some interesting things. It's too soon, I think, to be able to give assurance or for the National Audit Office to give assurance that it is avoiding things going wrong. And I guess that no approach will ever give you a blanket guarantee that things won't go wrong. But it has been investing in a centre of excellence that has up-to-date, very high-level digital skills, is investing in training people more widely across public services, and is making sure that the most up-to-date approaches are being used. Now, some of that thinking, I think, is being picked up with the Scottish Government's new approach to information systems, and the Chief Information Officer could tell you more about the approach that they're taking. But in a sense, both are an attempt to tackle the conundrum that Mr. Neil has identified in the past, that it can be very hard for government and for public sector bodies to attract the very scarce and very highly paid skills that are needed to make projects of this nature work very well. That's one example we've seen. I think the report we're publishing in May give some other pointers to international good practice as well.
And is any similar work happening? You just described what the UK government's doing there. Is any similar work to that happening in Scotland?
Yes, you've heard from us and in evidence from the Permanent Secretary, the Chief Information Officer and others about the approach they're taking. And we have said that we think the approach being taken here in Scotland is a definite positive move. It is too soon for us to say that it's having the desired effect, that it's operating effectively and at the scale needed, particularly, I think, given the whole range of opportunities there is for using digital to transform the way public services are delivered and to reduce costs. So there are moves there, but it's too early to say they are fully effective.
Okay. To go back to the Scottish Government's role, do you know the last point at which the Government provided assurance on this project, public assurance?
Do you know, Catherine?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
The final gateway review, I would prefer to check and put that in writing. I would have said it was during 2014, but I would need to confirm that.
And I mean, at various points, the Scottish Government said that delivery confidence was either amber or green. Given all the background disputes, why in your audit, on your evidence, why were they saying that?
I think we answered a question earlier about the value of the gateway reviews and the other external checks that were done. And as we say in paragraphs 18 and 19, they identified some improvements, but were broadly giving amber and green ratings of delivery confidence. I think that comes down to two things. One, the overall approach, the waterfall approach that was being taken, which made the flaws impossible to see until it was handed over for user testing much later. And secondly, the levels of assurance that were being given by Accenture at that point. And that's a common theme all the way through. So Accenture was expressing its confidence very highly. The approach to producing the system meant that it couldn't be tested by the users independently of Accenture until later on. So really at that point the reviews were focusing on the processes that were in place and relying on the assurances coming from Accenture.
Would it be fair to say that the amber or green warnings were more about the government's confidence in the two parties trying to sort out a problem rather than amber or green on delivery of the actual project?
Catherine?
I think in one of the earlier health checks, they comment on, I think it was around this contract variation stage, so it would have been April 2014. They do comment on the relationship challenges between the two parties, but it focused very much on the programme management side of things and contract management side of things. So it made recommendations around ensuring that the Police Scotland retain. There was some discussion around if it was the SPA or Police Scotland who would oversee the contract management. And the report recommended it was Police Scotland, but also that they build in an extra layer of governance, having an IT scrutiny forum. So I think that was one of the health checks that had an amber. Then at the next point, they had taken on board, Police Scotland had taken on board that recommendation, had put in place an IT scrutiny forum with representatives from the SPA and Police Scotland on it, and it moved to green at that stage. I think it was 2000 in August was one of the final checks. But I also think there was a technical assurance done very late on. I think when some of the issues were at that point, obviously there was already the system was going to fail. I think that was the last one, which I don't have in my chronology, but we can double check that.
It's probably worth just stressing, Convener, that the Scottish Government's various reviews and health checks are technical processes. So they are looking at the content of the contract and the way it's being delivered, rather than being the sort of policy oversight of the establishment of the SPA and Police Scotland.
Okay. Auditor General John Foley of the Scottish Police Authority said that there was no detriment to the public purse as a result of the I6 programme. Is that an accurate statement?
It's accurate in relation to the direct cash costs to the SPA and Police Scotland. They did recover the payments they'd made to Accenture and a significant sum larger than the payments made to compensate for staff time, software licenses and hardware maintenance. So in those terms, and bearing in mind that the negotiated sum was a negotiation and an estimate, there's no loss to the public purse. It's also, though, absolutely true to say that the I6 programme was central to achieving many of the benefits of police reform in terms of both the savings that would help to close the funding gap I've reported on to you previously, and the operational benefits to enable police officers and staff to carry out their work more effectively.
Yeah. As Mr Neil said, it's the loss of the benefits to them. Yeah. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Auditor General, Accenture said that the user requirements were increasing, but Police Scotland said that they were staying the same. Who was telling the truth?
I think Mark's given you a very clear picture of the user requirements as set out in the contract being the the element that took precedence within the contract variation embedded that in what Accenture had agreed to do. There were changes to the programme that went through the contract variation process, that, as you would expect in any area, but we don't think the core of this is the police continually revising their requirements. Okay. Mark, do you want to add to that?
I mean, there were changes. The original contract had a structure within it, a change control process, which allowed mutually agreed changes to be made. What Accenture were arguing to the programme board was, as I've described before, this elaboration of requirements. You're making it more complicated than you initially said. Whereas Police Scotland were saying, no, we were very clear in our user requirements about what we expected this to do. And as we've described before, that gap was never filled.
Okay. And given these two differences of opinion, have they both accepted the findings of the report?
Yes. As the committee knows, I agree the factual content of my reports with the people I'm reporting on. In formal terms, that relates to public bodies, government, Police Scotland, SPA in this case. But as a matter of courtesy, I sent a copy to Accenture as well and asked for their comments on the factual accuracy of it.
Okay. We touched on the fact that there has been no detriment to the public purse and that the operational benefits have actually suffered as a result of this. Do you think it's had any adverse effect on the staff?
Again, in terms of opportunity cost, there's no question it has. I say in the report that police officers, police staff are still having to use 130 manual or IT processes, many of which come from the legacy forces before Police Scotland was established. There are problems with officers and staff having to enter the same data into multiple systems, having to search multiple systems to get information back out again. Time wasted doing that, the risk of errors being introduced when data is being entered again, all of which makes police officers and staff jobs more difficult and also reduces the time they have available to spend actually providing policing services. So
have there been any improvements to the IT system at all?
There certainly have been. The Police Scotland has invested in a new national network and in replacing outdated desktop computers, some of the hardwares, and there are other projects that have been underway to deal with things like managing custody, which is an important part of police business. All of that is good and is progress, but it's not a substitute for the benefits that I6 was intended to achieve. Okay,
and you mentioned before the Policing 2026 document, and obviously it's quite ambitious in its use of technology going forward. Do you think a single national IT system for policing is still viable?
I think that's a question you should ask the SPA and Police Scotland, but I think their response to my report has been that they wouldn't go about it this way again, that this experience has been quite salutary, whether it's around the way in which they would procure the IT that's needed or indeed the way they plan it, that they would take a more incremental approach, learning from this experience and from the way that things are done more widely in the technology world these days.
Okay, and you did say that there is no current timescale for any IT system coming forward. Again, I suppose this is a question for the police and the SPA. Are there any indications of them even thinking that far ahead at the moment?
I think, as the Auditor General said in her opening comments, we're going to follow up on that through our annual audit process. Yeah. What we did hear about it is smaller components being taken forward, building on systems which had been used by other police forces, either elsewhere in the UK or from the legacy Scottish forces, but it had been done very much on a bit by bit basis, so a very small component of it would be being rolled out and developed. I think what we're waiting to see is, once the Policing 2026 strategy is finally agreed, what are the implementation plans underneath that, and a key to that will be your ICT strategy and how you're going to get to that vision that's outlined in 2026.
Okay. Do you think they'll be ready to have that when the Policing 2026 plan is finalised?
I think that's a question for the SPA and Police Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Liam Kerr. Just on that 2026, you had Exhibit 1 on page 7 about the 6 areas representing 80% of policing activity. had this system worked, had it been set up and running, then it would have been designed to deal with those 6 areas. But given the Police 2026, would it now already be obsolete?
Again, I'm sorry to be boring, but I think that's a question for the SPA. What I can say with confidence is that I6 was intended to cover around 80% of the information flows around policing. So lots of the case studies that are used in the 2026 strategy around police officers gathering information about somebody who's missing or is acting strangely would fall within the sorts of categories you're seeing here, and that information would then be available to other people involved in the wider criminal justice system. Inevitably, it would need to continue evolving, as yours and my phones and tablets do. But at the core of it, I think, was absolutely aligned with what Policing 2026 is about. I can see Mark wants to add to that.
The Auditor General's got in before me. I was merely going to say that sort of the vision of officers being based in police cars and using tablets as a way of recording information and sharing it, it would have been very hard to envisage that when at the origins of the I6 programme, sort of 2010, 2011. But fundamentally, the principles of information sharing and being able to do searches across the whole system, that sort of thing, those principles remain very, very valid, I think.
And just a final question that I think the public would like to know, which is, Accenture seem to have held their hands up on this and accepted a significant degree of responsibility. But it begs the question, do Accenture still tender for public contracts? And if so, do they still have the prospect of winning them?
Deep breath.
I'm sure Accenture are tendering for public contracts. We're not aware of whether they are actively involved in any at the moment in Scotland, or whether they hold any in Scotland. I'm afraid we don't know.
Thank you.
Would you be able to find that out, Mr. Robertson, write to the committee? Or is that commercially confidential?
I suspect it probably tendering of potential bids, I think, certainly would be commercially in confidence. Maybe that's a question for Accenture.
Yeah, it's something we can explore in Parliament. Can I ask, as a result of this failure, were there any operational errors that you identified?
I think it would be impossible to link any operational failings directly to the failure of this programme. Having said that, we're all aware of things that have gone wrong in policing around call handling and other aspects of operational policing, and this system was intended to make those things more reliable, more efficient, more effective, directly for the police officers and staff involved, and more importantly for all of us around Scotland. Mark, do you want to?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning. I'm now going to suspend committee until 10:15. Thank you. We now move on to considering the Auditor-General's report entitled Changing Models of Health and Social Care. We did not have time to consider this report at our meeting on the 9th of February, so can I apologise for that, and can I thank the panel for coming back before us again today. I welcome to the meeting Paul Gray, Director-General Health and Social Care and Chief Executive NHS Scotland, Shirley Rogers, Director of Health, Workforce and Strategic Change, Christine McLaughlin, Director of Health Finance, and Fiona McQueen, Chief Nursing Officer from the Scottish Government. Paul Gray does not wish to make an opening statement, so we will move straight to questions, the first of which is from Alex Neil.
Thank you, Convener. Since this is the first public session I've been back at since my recent incident, can I just put on record the excellent care from the ambulance service and the cardiac unit at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, and it was second to none. So put that in context, given the bad publicity the National Health Service gets very unfairly on a day-to-day basis. I think it's worthwhile just recording that. Can I begin just by asking a simple question? I mean, obviously, the issue of health inequalities, as we know, is one of the major reasons why we have such a substantial health challenge in Scotland. But the plan doesn't seem to deal with health inequalities. Indeed, it barely mentions health inequalities. Why not?
Well, first of all, Mr Neil, I'm very pleased we were able to look after you and glad to see you back, despite your question. The arrangements for the governance of the implementation of the delivery plan include a strand on population health improvement, and I'll ask Shirley Rogers in a moment to say a bit more about that, because we regard the improvement of the health of the population and the work that we do on prevention as being absolutely essential to the longer term development of an engagement with the population that helps everyone to understand what they can do to develop and improve their own well-being, as well as what the services, not just the health service, can do. But I'll ask Shirley to say something about how we plan to integrate that with the overall delivery arrangements which are already in place.
Thanks very much. It is very nice to see you looking so well.
Thank you.
Public health, population health improvement, one of a very small number of key themes of the delivery plan, and you'll see quite a lot of attention around primary care and all of the initiatives around public health improvement through that lens. We're also proposing in here to try and bring together a public health resource for Scotland to try and make sure that we've got a cohesive and strategic approach to public health and population health. There are a number of strands of work that we're taking forward around alcohol, obesity, all of the social inclusion areas around health. We spent a lot of time looking at investment around health visitors, for example, to try and put that process in place. All of the early years collaborative work that I know you're very familiar with, around giving children the best possible start in Scotland. So the programme takes into account all of those pieces of work and tries to bring them together into something which is comprehensive and can give us measured deliverables. And that's really where we'll be targeting the firepower of the delivery plan over the next 4 or 5 years, is in trying to make sure that we've got comprehensive plans in place across the piece and having some proper programme management to make sure that they are delivering the sorts of outcomes that we need to have. Now, as you are very well aware, some of those ambitions go way beyond the lifetime of any government. They go into the next 20, 30 years to try and improve population health in those ways. So we're setting out in this, the first of the delivery plans, the principles that we'll be taking forward, with the view that over the next few years we'll be able to learn, develop and put forward additional proposals that will improve that situation.
I agree with all of that and I wouldn't object to any of it, but I don't see in the plan, let me give you an example. Very clearly the deep end practices have a major role to play in reducing inequalities, and we need to get away from flat funding of GPs so that we positively discriminate in favour of those who need the additional resources in order to reduce inequalities to prevent some of the health problems that we face. But there's nothing in here to tell me, for example, you know, what additional resources are deep end practices going to get? What's the anticipated impact of additional resources? When are they going to get them? Where are they going to get them? Etc. And it's, you know, so from a delivery plan, that's the kind of information that I would be looking for. I mean, the inverse care law has been with us, I think, since 1971. And we've never really tackled it. And it seems to me that all the evidence mounts that we've really got to tackle that. And the other wider point is, for example, the government's introducing a child poverty bill to set targets for 2030 for reduction in child poverty. There's nothing in here that tells me what contribution health and social care is going to make to achieving those targets. I would have thought in a delivery plan you would need to put that kind of strategy and plan in.
Do you want to respond to that? Or do you...
So just to be clear, I mean, public health improvement is covered in pages 16 to 21, 16 to 20 of the plan. So I think we do want to be clear that it is there and not just in passing. We are, as the committee will know, putting additional resource into primary care. There are contractual negotiations going on at the moment over the contractual basis of engagement with general practice. We're building our commitment to multidisciplinary teams and a hub-based approach. I take your point, Mr Neil, about deep end practices, and as the delivery board, which Shirley chairs, develops further the detail of its proposals, then these things will inevitably come to the surface. But there is already additional funding in place. We have a £128 million transformation fund set up, which was announced, and I'll bring Christine in a moment just to say a bit more about the components of that and the additional investment in primary care. So I don't think we're disagreeing on the point of the importance of primary care and its centrality to the shift in the balance of care, which underpins a great deal of what we do, which will help us to move more activity out of the acute sector and into primary and community settings, bearing in mind we're speaking about this in the context of health and social care integration. But if the committee would find it helpful, the Finance Director can say more about the detail of the funding.
I think the issue, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the overall funding figures, obviously. The issue, I think, in a delivery plan like this is the distribution of the funding. Because if we just continue with the previous distribution of funding, then, if you like, the worried well, as Duncan McNeill used to call them, it will continue to get massively unfair access to the health resource and social care resource compared to the people who need it more and most. Now, obviously, things like tobacco, dealing with tobacco, and hopefully eventually we'll get to implement minimum unit pricing, and all of that stuff will help on public health and will help reduce inequalities. But it's about the NHS and social care resource. I don't see a strategy in here for dealing with the inverse care law any differently from how we've tried to deal with it over the last 30 years unsuccessfully.
Well, I'll bring Christine in a second, but I would point out that the work we're doing on the alcohol framework, the work that we're doing on delivering the mental and the maternal and infant nutrition framework, the work we're doing on mental health strategy, supporting mental health in primary care, all of these things are intended to tackle that very clear position that if you live in a more deprived area, you will find services harder to access and you are more likely to be unwell. We're not at all disputing these facts. I believe the components of what we're doing here are central to that, and I think the investment we're making on physical activity, the work that we're doing on building success in schools, all of these things are intended to tackle that issue. I have taken your point about the importance of specificity in, what are we going to do about things like deep end practices, but maybe Christine could say a little more.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the funding, it's implicit in everything that we're trying to do rather than a ring-fenced component for tackling inequality. So if you look at the spend in primary care, so although we've got the overall metrics about shift and 250 million in primary care and 500 million overall shifting from acute to community services. So it's something like deep end practice is a very specific area, as you know. I think this approach is more about trying to understand how you can enable things like GP clusters to have the impact they need to have in the parts of the country they need to have it, and using data through variation to understand why you've got things like higher prevalence of certain conditions in particular parts of the country and how you deal with them. So I think it's more about a whole system, data-driven approach, and the way in which we're trying to approach the funding is to be more flexible and less mandatory at the centre. I think about how that money is best applied locally. So I think that would be the answer I would give on the finances. It's there to go to where it needs to be directed to get the most benefit.
I don't dispute any of that, all of which is absolutely right. But when you read this, it looks like a mixture of a statement of intent and a wish list rather than a delivery plan. If you look at the English business plan for the National Health Service, which is done on a national basis as well, it's much more detailed about likely impact assessment, where resources are going to be distributed and how they're going to be delivered. I mean, can I just give you one example early on in the plan? And I'm not disagreeing with the aim here, but it says on page 8, by 2018 we aim to reduce unscheduled bed days in hospital care by up to 10% by reducing delayed discharges, avoidable admissions and inappropriately long stays in hospital. Well, we've been doing that for ages, for years, but you know, how are you going to do it so that you achieve that? You tell me what the target is and what you want to do, but it doesn't tell me what you're doing differently to achieve the target. That's what I mean, and that's riddled right through. You know, it's not a delivery plan; it's a statement of intent and a wish list, with which I would not disagree. But it doesn't tell me how you're going to deliver it. It doesn't tell me how, you know, the impact assessment of the various measures. It doesn't tell me the resource allocation. It doesn't tell me the things that I can see in the English plan that I can't see in the Scottish plan. And I'm happy to park that and give you time to think about it.
Well, I think the best thing I could do is to give you 3 pieces of assurance and then to offer you something in writing if that would help the committee.
Yeah.
The first thing is this plan relates to the budget we have. It is formed in relation to the sum of money that health has, but also in relation to what is available in other budgets, including local government, and therefore it is a funded, not an unfunded plan. Secondly, the level of detail you're asking for is precisely what we are working through with the delivery board. That's why we have a delivery board. But this is not simply aspirational. We are confident that the sums of money that are available are sufficient to deliver what we have been asked to do. And thirdly, you've spoken about effectively about risks to delivery. Of course there are risks to delivery, things change over time, but again that's why we have programme management arrangements and governance arrangements in place, because that is what they are there to deal with. That's why you have governance and oversight. But if the committee would find it helpful, I am more than happy to provide a more detailed breakdown of the components of this plan, how it will be delivered, and at what cost.
Can I just give an example, Paul? I mean, if it's a delivery plan, I would expect to see all the money figures in there, where they're being spent, when they're being spent, why they're being spent the way they're being spent, what you're doing differently that's going to make a difference. And secondly, I would expect to see some estimate of the impact it's going to make on health inequalities, on achieving the targets, and why it will be different, because clearly, and we need to wait and see what Harry Burns' review of targets says, but clearly the media concentrate all the time on when we miss our own targets, even although we're doing excessively better than the health service down south. You don't get credit for that, you only get abuse because you miss the targets. And therefore the question we have to ask is, well, how are you going to achieve the targets for A&E and all the rest of it in future, which very often at the moment we're not able, I mean, the treatment time guarantee is a good example. This doesn't tell me how you're going to, between now and the end of the planned period, actually achieve the treatment time guarantee. That's what I mean. I think you have to bring all this together so that somebody coming to this new and independently and neutrally can actually see the total picture. I don't see this as a plan. I see it as, you know, a worthwhile document, but essentially it's a statement of intent and a wish list. It's not a plan, as I would understand a plan. Question? No, I think Paul's offered to come back to us.
Yeah. So, Convener, I'm happy to go further on this or to take other questions, be guided by you, but I've committed to writing to the committee with more detail as Mr Neil has asked for it, and I'm happy to do that.
If you could, please, do you want to comment on the last bit that Mr Neil said, or do you just wish to write to us?
Well, I think this is a plan for delivery. We have given specific dates by which we intend to do things. I have committed to writing in more detail about the underpinning finances and where they will go. I believe that it is a robust plan. It is underpinned by data and evidence and clinical advice. We're happy to share all of that with the committee if they would find it helpful. I would describe it as a firm proposition and not as Mr Neil has described it.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. The one area, Mr Gray, that really concerns me is the role of the IGB's integration of care at a very local level. One thing that is highlighted in the Auditor General's report is the poor progress in regard to that. And the fact that, just to quote here, evidence suggests that the new partnerships with statutory responsibilities to coordinate integrated health and social care services, integration authorities, will not be in a position to make a major impact during 2016-17. And that's that really is a bit of a worry. And again, in the report, in paragraph 30, a common issue with many of the new care models being introduced across Scotland is a lack of evidence about the impact, implementation costs, efficiency gains, or cash savings, and indeed outcomes for service users. So it seems to be a big grey area, but it's such an important area, and you do highlight it in your delivery plan here as being fairly essential. Can you give me some feel as to what's happening there?
So, the Audit Scotland report I have, Changing Models of Health and Social Care, was prepared by Audit Scotland in March 2016. Actually before the first full year of operation, which we are now in, of integration. And a number of developments have taken place in the course of the first full year of integration, which give me confidence that we are heading in the right direction. Not every partnership is at the same point on the trajectory. You know, there is a degree of unevenness, but I have, and I'm not, I promise, going to go through them, 10 or 15 examples here of areas where integration is working well and which can give us confidence, and I'll share these with the committee in my written response that I've already agreed to give to Mr Neil. But I will give you two. I was in Ayrshire and Arran Health Board meeting them and the integration partnerships a week past on Friday, and I saw there the way in which they are changing the way, for example, that patients with COPD, cardiac obstructive pulmonary disease, falls, heart failure and diabetes are managed in a much more effective way, resulting in 49% fewer emergency admissions and 36% fewer bed days in the first 6 months for the caseload. And again, provide more detail on that. Dumfries and Galloway Integrated Hub has developed a single point of access for community health and social care services. So that's bringing together health and social care services called STAR Short-Term Augmented Response Service, and the third sector for people registered with 2 of the GP practices in Dumfries. And again, I can provide more detail on that, but that's reduced by up to 15 days, the referral time from GPs to care input, quicker inter-service handovers, increased capacity, but it's also improved communication, staff morale and team working. So I'm now seeing evidence that these things are working.
Do we see an effective transfer of budgets to make this happen? Because that was the key thing that seemed to be delaying it. Everybody had their own little fiefdom and they wouldn't give up what they had. How effective has it been, and how has it been achieved?
So the first year of any operational delivery will be, to use a non-technical word, clunky. I think that we learned a lot in the first year on budget setting, and there was a great deal of toing and froing, and there was a great deal of debate and discussion and negotiation about budget transfers, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The evidence I have suggests that having gone through that process, it will be much smoother this year. I'll bring Christine in a second. So I think we are, as you always do, learning from what you have done and improving as you go along. I think that's the right process. I am not claiming that such a transformational change as the integration of health and social care will go from nothing to perfection in 2 years. Nothing of that scale will or would. But I have now before me clear evidence of progress in local areas. The issues that I think have been worked through are around governance, leadership and trust. These are essential precursors to effectiveness, but what I'm now seeing is actual delivery on the ground that is making a difference. And if the committee would find it helpful, the Finance Director will say a bit about the budget process.
I'd be interested.
So Paul's right. The first year there was due diligence in advance, but actually what you saw was that through the year people were really understanding what the resources they had were able to buy, if you like, and where there were levers and where there were pressures within it. What we see now as partnerships planned for next financial year, 2017-18, is a much greater level of engagement all round between integration authorities, NHS boards and local authorities. That doesn't mean that everybody agrees all the time, and there are still issues in some parts of the country about signing off on the resources to deliver the plans in place. But what there's much more of is of the sharing of the information, and you see integration authorities and chief officers being part of the discussions about how resources are used on a much more of a day-to-day basis, starting to get into shared risk and shared ownership in some places in relation to things like delayed discharge performance, how you share investment in some new services that are looking to be planned. So there's definitely evidence of, I think, a more mature start to the relationships in budgets. But I think it's not until you really get into the bigger component of how that impacts on things like the acute sector that you really start to see some of the traction and some of the metrics, but certainly on delayed discharges, we're really starting to see some good work and real progress on the number of people delayed.
Looking at page 9 of the delivery plan, you're saying that shifting resources to the community by 2021, spending on primary care increased to 11% of the frontline NHS Scotland budget. Is that an arbitrary figure? What is it based on?
Based on our assessment of the right relative share to get the shift that the evidence suggests that we need to have. So no, it's not an arbitrary figure. It is also part of a negotiation between the government and the representative bodies. All of these things are effectively the subject of negotiation, but there is clear evidence that by putting that extra capacity into out-of-hospital care, there is the opportunity to transform and also to deliver better outcomes.
Okay.
Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. You talked just now about governance, leadership and trust, and this is a massive change in the NHS in Scotland from acute care to community care. And as we know and we've heard in previous sessions, members of the public are attached to buildings. They see hospitals as the main places to provide that care. And in a lot of senses, they are suspicious and slightly wary of change when it happens on this scale. So what is the Scottish Government doing to engage with the public, to raise awareness of the policy to shift the balance of care, and discussions with them, consultation, public engagement as to why services need to change?
Okay. So I suppose I use shifting the balance of care as shorthand, and the public wouldn't engage particularly well with that as a phrase. What I think is helpful to the public is concrete examples of what would be different and better for them. So, for example, in West Lothian, there is the REACT team, which visits people in their own homes and provides multidisciplinary care. And the way that people learn about it and come to appreciate it is by experiencing it, and I think that's hugely important. I think abstract statements of what what might happen are very hard for people to grasp onto. What we're doing is working with the health boards and the integration authorities to ensure that in terms of the health boards there is the appropriate level of engagement as defined by the Scottish Health Council, and through the integration authorities. The great benefit of the integration authorities is, of course, they engage local authority elected members, and local authorities have already, I believe, and I say I believe it because I've seen it, very well developed approaches to engagement with the public, which I think we benefit from and learn from. So through what's established, we are ensuring that there is appropriate engagement. I think the issue, though, is to make that specific and, I was going to say concrete, but that might bring us back to buildings, specific and real, rather than, as I say, generalised propositions about shifting the balance of care. So when, instead of starting with basically starting the sentence in the wrong place, which is, we've got this building and we're going to knock it down, that always gets people nervous, and rightly so. Starting the conversation with, here are the developments in healthcare that would allow us to provide you with a better service. Here is how that could be delivered. Here is how you can be engaged in deciding and agreeing what your care should be. That's a much better conversation. It doesn't just come through the fora of health boards directly or integration partnerships directly, but for example, the conversations that are going on in the context of the National Clinical Strategy, in particular realistic medicine, are about having discussions between clinicians and individuals about what would be the best care for them. Most often, if people are engaged in decisions about their care, the outcomes are better for them, and most often people prefer not to be over-treated. The Chief Nursing Officer could say more about that if that was helpful to the committee.
And I think that is, as Paul has said, people are anxious about buildings, and you've said yourself. And I think that relationship between clinicians and the public is incredibly important. We know that they trust them in terms of the decision making, and helping them to understand that what you used to go to hospital for, you now can actually have better treatment, better outcomes at home or in a more localised setting. And I suspect the care that Mr Neil received is a slightly more acute version of that, in terms of that very rapid transfer, perhaps not to the nearest hospital, and very much shorter length of stay and home. And the community always appreciate these good outcomes when they experience it, and the whole strand of realistic medicine and moving things forward with the National Clinical Strategy, where we can have that dialogue with people, is something that we're taking forwards.
Okay. Thanks for that. You mentioned about, and you know, there's a lot of people, we're all involved with reassuring members of the public that they're going to receive the best care, absolutely, and you know, local authorities and NHS boards. Do you think, what do you think is the best way for NHS boards to engage with the public?
That's a very big question. because and the short answer is, of course, it depends. It depends what it's about. Let me tell you some things that are not good ways of engaging with the public. Sending out letters. You can't ask a letter a question. So engaging with the public has to really involve engagement of people with people. That if I was just giving one fundamental answer to your question, that would be it. Other ways that do and don't work. What does work is giving people something to see. So if you're describing a facility, as soon as you can give folk an idea of what it would be, where it would be located, what it would look like. If you're describing a new, what we call care pathway, in other words, a new way of treating people, get someone to talk it through, describe it, give a case study of a patient and a clinician actually having a conversation, rather than some, a dry document that says, here's a new care pathway for this condition, and asking people, in a sense, to work out what it would mean for them. So I much prefer to give people something to look at and something to hear and something to see, and above all, the opportunity to ask questions. We shouldn't be afraid of being challenged. The public have some really good ideas about what would be best for them.
Okay. And certainly in a lot of big organisations, when there's massive change taking place, some of the best advocates of that change are the staff themselves. Yeah. Are your staff fully informed and on board with the changes and able to talk in the general public about what they are and what they mean?
So I'll bring both Shirley and Fiona in on that point, because it's hugely important. And I'm going to start by saying I don't think we always get that right. I don't think we always get it right. We have partnership arrangements which work well and are well regarded. But if we're talking about investing in talking to people, we need to treat our staff well and treat the public well. That's absolutely essential. The very best part of my job is going and talking to people, whether it be staff or patients. That's where I learn the most. Now, I believe that leaders in any health and care system ought to devote a significant proportion of their time of speaking to the people who deliver the services and speaking to the people who receive them. That's how you'll learn if it's working. But Shirley and Fiona will both have things to say about that.
If I can pick up a couple of themes and address that one specifically. Going back to Mr Neil's observations about what's different, part of the planning processes and delivery processes that are signalled in this plan give a huge and I think very welcome prominence around national, regional, local, community and individual. And I think we miss a trick if we lose sight of that. So the kind of prioritisation that Mr Neil was talking about, whether it's in GP practices or in particular areas of need, are specifically addressed through us not determining at a national level, but allowing those local communities, allowing those local IJBs to prioritise particular actions. And that's really important for a number of reasons, not least the communications point that you're making. It's important because it means that communities get what they need, but it also means that communities are themselves advocating for the things that they want, the changes that they need to see, and I think that's really, really important. We are creating national narrative, but we're also making sure that we've... So if I think about what I've been doing personally for the last 3 months since we published it...
This a bit tighter, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll do my best, thank you. We've spent a lot of time talking to all of the communities around health. So we haven't just talked to chief execs and chairs, we've talked to nurses and HR people and OD people and all the rest of it, so that they can do precisely what you're talking about. We've spent a lot of time talking to staff. The focus of this year's NHS event is exactly in that space about people making change happen, so that we can do precisely the kinds of things that you're talking about, where we've got not 10 or 12 people, but 156,000 people talking to their communities that they're part of about the sorts of changes that are proposed.
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to follow on from questioning that was started by Alec Neil round about the NHS in Scotland 2016 report's recommendations for flexibility, financial flexibility for NHS boards, and I appreciate the answer that he gave to him about that aspiration. So just to drill down a bit more in the detail about what steps have been taken to follow up on those recommendations, and also what financial plans are being prepared to be put in place.
So there's a narrow point about how boards achieve financial balance in individual years. And so there's a wider point about living within your means generally and having sustainability. So on the narrower point about flexibility, I think our position on that is, I hope, quite clear, which is that we do provide services for boards to have a level of flexibility between one year and another. Largely that's something that we can plan for if it's something like a major new project or a new hospital, and we can plan over a number of years. Sometimes, as you know, with a particular number of boards just now, there's issues about financial sustainability, and we'll provide financial assistance that we look to have repaid. And you recall that from the discussions we had last time round in NHS Tayside. So the work that we are doing just now with boards is about looking at their 5-year plan that underpins this work for the delivery plan. Boards right now will be giving us their local delivery plans by the end of this month, which will focus in detail on 2017-18. So we'll have them at an individual board level, and we're asking boards now, as part of the delivery plan, to start to work regionally, and I expect us to move into a position where we look to have regional resource envelopes that can be provided, so that it gives another level of flexibility, one layer down, if you like, which is some regional flexibility in how resources are deployed. So, for instance, if money becomes a barrier to moving a service or to sharing a service, then we want to try to take away some of those barriers. But I think that we can. There is a position within which the portfolio needs to be able to balance overall, and Scottish Government balance overall. So within those parameters, I think that we're doing everything that we can to provide that flexibility. But in return, what we ask the boards for is to be able to look far enough ahead to understand the longer term position, and to plan as much as they can for the knowns and the unknowns, and to be really clear on the risk assessment within that.
Following on very nicely from that, is if you could tell me the work that you're actually doing with the boards to drill down on a more local level, to ensure that there's that sufficient resource and investment in the community to meet that objective of shifting it from, shifting that balance of care from hospital to the community. So it's just to understand what you're doing with them to ensure that support is going to be.
Okay, so the initial thing that we've done as part of the funding settlement for next financial year is to put some very clear criteria in place, some of which is to say that we expect the total sum of money to be spent on non-acute areas to be maintained, which is only one sentence in a letter, but it's actually a real shift, I think, in our clarity of the direction that we seek from the resources that are spent in the NHS. So we've been very clear that we expect spend on integration authorities to be maintained, and that's about £8.2 billion. That we expect spend on primary care and mental health as a minimum to be maintained. And the additional investment that we are putting in, so the 70 million in primary care, the additional money in mental health, that should all be over and above those core recurring funding levels, and we've asked for assurance from boards that that's being delivered. So that's quite a crude measure, but it then means that we expect best use of the resources then that are maintained in that area, and so we will see in these local delivery plans at the end of the month the assurance that we get from the boards and the descriptions they give us of how they're doing that.
Yeah. Well, again, following on from that and how we ensure that funding levels are maintained, and it touches also on the point that Colin Beattie asked, which is within the delivery plan. It states that it will, and I'll quote from it, ensure health and social care partnerships increase spending on primary care services so that spending on primary care increases to 11% of the frontline NHS Scotland budget. So given that, I think in a previous answer we talked about some of it being subject to negotiation and looking for assurances, what can you do to ensure that that is the case, that that level is met, and where is the detail and the plan to back that up so we can then monitor whether or not that is being achieved?
Can I answer very briefly, and I also want to ask, if I may, the convener a question. When I said it was subject to negotiation, I'm not suggesting the 11% is subject to negotiation, but what happens with it is. And convener, you've other business today, I know. Can you give me guidance on how long you'd like to allow for this session, and we'll try and tailor our answers to that appropriate length?
We have time, Mr. Gray, so please, okay. I'm not so concerned as I was a few minutes ago, so please say what you need to say.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll hand you back to Christine, but I do want to make that point. I'm not suggesting we'll negotiate the 11% in some different direction, but what happens to it must necessarily be the subject of negotiation.
So one thing I was going to suggest is that we had written back to the Health and Sport Committee in some detail on this point to give that clarity, because there are a number of metrics. There's the 11%, and but the bigger point I think is the shift of the 500 million by the end of this parliamentary term. So we have the modelling that we've done suggests that should be a realistic projection over the lifetime. In fact, if you can't achieve a sum of that level, then there isn't going to be a shift on the ground in services. So the assurance comes not so much just from the money and those overall conditions that we set, but it comes from being able to see a service that was provided in an acute hospital being provided in a different way in the community. So what we now need to do is build up the detail of those individual types of changes on the ground to understand how that comes together. But I can give you that detail on our assumptions, but if you think about the fact that we, by the end of the Parliament, should have in healthcare over £14 billion, then that additional cash investment needs to get directed to the areas that we need it to get directed to. But because we have a level of planning assumptions in there about health funding in cash terms over the period, it allows us to have a bit more certainty about if that was to continue, then how we'd see that directed. And on that basis, getting to a position of 500 million doesn't seem unreasonable to me.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Mr. Gray, in terms of social care, based on the evidence, what is better in terms of care and the public purse? Private providers or local authority directly employed carers?
Generally speaking, continuity of care is important. So if you bring in providers from time to time, that's much less likely to be a good outcome for people. It's not that it can't be, but you would want to be sure that what you were doing was using an approach which provided continuity of care. The standards of quality that would be expected were we occasionally to use the private sector are the same. There is no difference. But I believe that having care provided by the National Health Service, which I will speak for specifically, is the right thing, because I have a set of standards, a set of behaviours, an expectation about integrity that I am, as the leader of the National Health Service, able to put in place and to have systems and processes in place to ensure that that happens through things like iMatter and through our engagement with the partnerships. Therefore, I believe that that is the approach that is most likely to yield good care. But
that's directly employed by the IJBs.
Yeah, well, directly employed by the NHS.
Yeah.
And similarly, local government have directly employed staff, they are subject obviously to their standards and to their guidelines. And again, I would focus my answer on the continuity of care and on the ethical standards of the public sector.
I mean, this is perhaps more a question for the Auditor General, but you know, we know, for instance, in the health service that to employ an agency nurse, it costs the public purse 3 times as much as it does for a contracted nurse, and we've discussed that before. Do you know the difference in terms of social carers going into people's homes in terms of directly employed by the NHS or the IGB and the private companies such as Avenue and other care providers?
I don't have that level of detail, Convener. It could easily be got for you. But the problem is it will vary from area to area.
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm perfectly happy to provide it to the extent that it's available.
Could you please? That would be very useful, and I'll make the same request of the Auditor General. On page 18 of the delivery plan, there's a reference to consult on a new strategy on diet and obesity. If I'm right in thinking, but I know you'll know this, Mr Gray, there's an obesity strategy due out from the government any day now. Is that referring to the same thing?
As far as I'm aware, yes. I mean, this is the approach that we're taking, to have a consultation, and this is an area that we believe needs to be given further impetus, and that's why we're doing it.
Okay, but if the obesity plan is due out every day, why is there another strategy, consult on a new strategy? Is that?
Sorry, we're putting out a plan for consultation.
I see, right, okay, that clears that up. Can I turn to the final page, 21, the GERFEC paragraph 36.
Yes.
It says, in addition to actions included in the main components of the work above, we will drive this agenda through continued implementation, in particular the named person and child's plan. I read from that implementation of named person and child's plan is continuing. Has that changed since John Swinney's statement a couple of weeks ago?
I'm genuinely not entirely sure what question you're putting to me.
Okay, so on page 21, paragraph 36, GERFEC, it says quite clearly that actions from this plan are continued implementation of the named person scheme. Is that continuing to be implemented, or has that implementation halted since the Supreme Court ruling?
So I mean, we will, as the civil service, proceed in line with what the Deputy First Minister has said. That would be the answer to that question.
But my interpretation of what he said was that there was to be a pause. So I take it that your civil servants will be pausing this implementation. Is that right?
This was published in December 2016 when the situation was as it was then. If ministers subsequently introduce a pause, then that's, you know, we operate in line with what the government and the Parliament agree. So
you know that civil servants and NHS boards have paused implementation of the named person scheme, is that right?
I know that we react exactly as ministers would expect us to what they say, that the CNO can.
So as part of this, there was a commitment to 500 additional health visitors. And part of the work we did in terms of looking at supporting young people and early intervention to reduce inequalities would be to introduce what we call a universal health visiting pathway. So to standardise how our health visitors support families from pre-birth to school-aged children. And some of that at times can be conflated with the named person. The named person has duties and responsibilities that clearly have paused and are being reviewed. But at the same time, we are continuing in terms of getting it right for every child to implement the universal health visiting pathway, which is additional home visits for families by a qualified health visitor. So we're continuing with that element, which would support implementation of the named person in terms of sharing and taking data sharing and responsibility. So as Paul said, that the element of the legislative process has been paused, but the elements of and the benefits of having the additional health visitors to support families in a more comprehensive way is continuing, but being mindful and cognizant of the legislative issues.
Okay. Yes.
Supplementary to that, because it's now 3 years since we decided to increase the number of health visitors by 500. Fiona, how many of the 500 have now been appointed?
So I can send the specific numbers. So we have trained over 398. And on top of that, the 16 and 17, we're training an additional 163 health visitors. So we are moving to be on target for that implementation of certainly having the health visitors in training, if not qualified by that time. But we are making steady and good progress.
So when do you reckon we'll have 500 additional health visitors actually working?
So that's a moving feast, and I can give more accurate projections and trajectory in writing for you for that.
Can I thank you all, unless members have any further questions, can I thank you all very much for your evidence this morning. I now move the committee into private session and suspend for 2 minutes.